Hi, welcome to Building SaaS with Python and Django. My name is Matt Lehman, and I am the streamer on this channel. And we talk about Python and the Django web framework and building a SaaS, a software as a service. And today we're going to work on settings management and configuration. Doesn't sound like a riveting topic, but I think there's some really interesting stuff that we can dig into as we get into it and look at some fun tools to explore it. We have been going about this process of cleaning up my deployment and simplifying things and ripping out tools, ripping out extra stuff. And I think this is another step along that path. Before we get going, I'll let you know about some stuff, places to reach me if you're interested. There's mattlehman.com, which you can check out. You can see the link above and the banner at the top. I'm also on Twitter as MBLehman. And I've got mailing lists that you can find on my website, all sorts of avenues to get in touch with me. I also have a Patreon account, and I'm thankful to my current patrons, Mark and Patrick. Thank you so much for your contribution. If you like what you find here and want to help me out, you can. The easiest way would be to follow, like. I put videos up on YouTube. Just promote in any way you can. That would be helpful to me. So that other people can find stuff about this project that we do. And if you're able to give financially, that would be amazing. And I would be totally grateful for that. So information on how to connect with me on Patreon is on my website. So as I said, we're going to talk about settings today. So settings is the subject of the day. And you can ask me anything about Python or Django. If that's where you're coming from, I will pause to try and answer questions. Can't go too far off topic probably, but happy to field some questions. So please at least keep the chat civil. If you can't, I will kick you out. So today, looking at the subject of settings, I want to take a minute to talk about what is my beef with the way that we handle settings in Django, different ways that you can manage settings. And then some of the tools that we might consider to use to improve settings management in my project. My project is called Conductor on GitHub. All the code is up there that you can check out at your leisure. It powers a site called collegeconductor.com, which is a software as a service for college admissions. We won't dig in too much of the details of this particular product tonight. We'll just mostly be looking at code, which has very little to do with the actual ins and outs of the product. So I created this issue last time. I put this note to consider a GoodCop, but before we dig into specific tools, I thought we could talk about settings in general and the good and bad of the way Django handles settings. So I'm going to start up Vim here, and we're going to jump into my my settings file. If you've ever started a Django project, you will probably be aware that the starter project template has you creating settings, and you put in a bunch of configuration, and you put in some extra stuff that you accrue along the way from other tools that you might add on, and it all gets put into this lovely Python file. So that's the observation number one about settings, is that the way Django handles it is these settings are a Python file, which means that it gets executed stuff that can be just as dynamic as any other Python code. And what you get in here might change depending on what gets executed. So my one thing, the reason I want to explore settings tools and improving that stuff is because I think there's stuff gets a little conflated between what is configuration and what is actual settings. And what I mean by that is stuff like, here's a good example. If we look at installed apps, these are the things that are the pieces that get plugged into your Django app or to your Django project, excuse me. And as a refresher, if you haven't, I haven't done this explanation in a while, but Django is structured as, the top level is the Django project, and each of the components or subsystems within that project are called applications. So this notion of app does not mean your whole Django top level thing. It's all of the pieces that compose it together. But if you look at this, there's nothing about this that needs really outside input. This is this installed apps is the list of every application that your project is going to use, and is intentionally a very static list. And it only changes whenever you're adding a new integration for a third-party tool that you care about, or you might create a new app internally to your project, which is, you can see here, I've got my internal conductor apps at the bottom of my list here. So in my mind, this is purely configuration, and it's not going to change frequently. You wouldn't want to have knobs and controls on this that can be influenced from the outside. So it's a weird thing, in my opinion, to call that a setting. Now, in contrast, if we jump to the bottom where I've introduced some other stuff, there are things that are in here. And frankly, the way they're in here right now is just to have a kind of a placeholder. So here's a good example. If you sign up with College Conductor, I use Stripe as the service to do that actual exchange of money, to get, take a credit card, make a payment, start someone on a plan that is a recurring thing. Stripe is the payment gateway to do that. And in order for Stripe to work, you have to have an API key that you get from their system, and this other Stripe publishable key that can be public to also identify you. So these two things go together to power the Stripe library that goes in here. This absolutely is settings stuff, because it can vary depending on a number of contexts. My local development, I don't want to make real charges to Stripe. Stripe thankfully provides test keys that you can use and fill into these settings so that you can kind of kick the tires and make sure that your sign-up flow or whatever process you have is working the way you expect it to. But when you want to start charging real money, you want to be able to replace this stuff with the actual production settings. And so that's to me is the difference between what Django mixes all into one big bag of what they call settings. Is some of it's very static and some of it's meant to be dynamic. And my motivation for changing this file is that I want it to be very clear of, here are the parts that will rarely change, the configuration, and here are the parts that will change and are configurable externally as settings. So we're going to look at some tools, and honestly, I have one in mind, but I'm not sold on it. So we'll explore the space and see what options are available. I'll list my kind of requirements that I think I have for this process, and see what we can see about configuration tools. So I want to start. There's actually a fairly new aspect of Django that has come about. Django has added a discourse site for doing forum stuff, and it's at a very new stage, but there's been some interesting discussion that's already happened there. So if you are not familiar with it, you can go to forum.djangoproject.com and sign up and be part of that conversation. Of course, you don't have to sign up to view the stuff. It's all publicly available. But I want to jump into this topic about top 5 packages. It's been an interesting conversation from people to see what they choose as their main tools, and some of these were interesting from the configuration perspective, and I had never heard of them before. So I want to pause and make sure that when we're evaluating the configuration tools, that we're giving a fair shake to the different tools that are out there, see what their capabilities are, and then decide on a tool that has everything that we're looking for. I don't think it was in Will Vincent's post, but I saw one. We're gonna have to stare at this for a little bit to get back up. I think this might have been one of them. Django Environ. So Environ kind of indicates environment. Environ. That's a hard word for me to say. Environ is also, if you do Python, if you import OS from Python, not import, good grief, import OS, then at os.environ is something that behaves mostly like a dictionary. It's not strictly a dictionary if you look at if you check out the type of it, but it behaves mostly like one. And that's where the environment variables for the process are stored. So that's an operating system level concern, which is, that hints at why the name is here something similar. So let's look at the documentation to see briefly what it covers and why you might want to use it. So one style of deploying applications is to use 12-factor. 12-factor, you can go to 12factor.net, I believe, and it will outline what they consider a 12-factor a 12-factor application. It's basically a style that says, let me get the settings and stuff externally injected into the app. Let the app itself be a stateless chunk of code that can just execute requests, and any configuration and anything that changes about it, you put into it, kind of like a dependency injection pattern, if you're familiar with that. So one of these things, yeah, okay, it's got it broken down in there's a config section that talks about pushing stuff into environment variables listed here. And you can have different environments to power these things for development, for testing, production, staging, QA, however many environments you have, all have their own set of environment variables. And so the idea is when you start up your application, the application will go out to something like os.environ and look for the environment variables. And if it can't find them, if you're being really strict about it, we'll just fail to even start. Say like, hey, you did not provide me the Stripe API key, and this is not going to work unless I have one of those, for example. So I think Django Environ is designed to, rather than fiddle with the OS module directly, maybe has some method to smooth that over. So let's take a look and see what it's kind of providing. So the way, looks like you create this environment and you can read an environment file if you have it. So that's a common convention, like this, what you see here, this .env is a file that people will often put in their project. They'll add it to, oh, the chat is telling me that I can't start. It looks like a command. The file is .env. And people will add it to their git ignore, and by adding it to the git ignore, it gives you a place to, if you did need to test out, like, let's think of a scenario. Let's say before you wanted to deploy your site with actual production keys, you wanted to try a sign-in and charge a real credit card. So you pull out your own credit card and you put in your production keys in a .environment file. You start up your application, run it locally, go through the sign-up process manually yourself through your local host version of the site, and make a real charge to your application. You can go to your Stripe dashboard, clean it out later, do whatever you need to do. But if you didn't have this capacity to create a file that could override settings, then that option would not even be available to you. So this is a technique that can give you kind of an override control, which is one way to do this. I think you could probably also do this as your actual deployment. So maybe you have a deployment tool that will create the environment file and just drop it in the right location along with your app, and process it and get going. So that's one way to do this, which is a reasonable path. So what it looks like what this thing's doing is starting by setting what things should it even be looking for. Like debug is one of the things that it will look for. And then here's a big important part. It is decoupling what the environment variable setting name is of env of debug here to the Django setting of debug, which is an actual Python variable. That's an important distinction. And you can see here something important that it's doing is that it's taking a function to try and cast your local environment variable to whatever the type probably is. So in this mode, I would guess you would put in your environment variable maybe the string of true. Actually, that's a good question. How is that cast going to work? I'm curious about that, but we'll not dig too much into that, because what needs to live in debug is the actual Boolean value of true or false, not a string of true or false. And environment variables, by their nature in the operating system, are strings by default. So if you need to coerce something, which means change it from a string type to some other type, like a Boolean, then you have to give some kind of hint to your tool, to your settings tool, to how to do that conversion. So this is going to be kind of like a reasonable requirement of whatever configuration tool I end up choosing, is to have this ability to specify the type, so that you're not doing that yourself, because it's totally impossible. It's totally possible to say os.environ of debug, and maybe let's try and do this with code. What would that look like? So I'm gonna pretend, so that let's pretend that a variable of debug is equal to os environ debug. Okay, and so what's going to come out of that in reality is the string. Initially, the string would be like true or something. So if you do bool on debug, that's going to be true. But here's the weird part about Python. I think that if we change this, like if we just did bool on the string of false, it's also true. All right, so that's tricky bit number one, is like, in terms of Python's truthiness. So Python has this notion of a truthy algorithm that defines what gets considered truthy or not. And I want to say that the only falsy string is the empty string. Okay, see what happened there? Like, even though this had the word false in it, it still was considered true because it had characters. So Python's not trying to be cute and think, oh, you tried to say false, so you wanted false. There are plenty of tools that will do this, like YAML is one example that you can give it a bunch of things. Like, I think you can give it T or F or lowercase false or lowercase true, or I think it'll even handle like yes and no or just N. There's all sorts of weird conditions that YAML will try and change something to YAML's version of Boolean, which can catch you by surprise if you're not prepared for that. So I don't actually know what you'd have to set in this tool to actually set something to false value. Oh, it's saying if it's not even in there. Okay, so it's like flat out excluding it so you can only turn it on by setting it to setting some value in your environment. So that's an interesting way to go about this. And it looks like some of this stuff has been considered specifically for Django projects. That's pretty cool about this tool. Like, if you see this here, you set the database URL, you set it as database URL in this format, which is a pretty common format of providing, what type of connector is it, what's the user, what's the password, where's the database, all that stuff. You set that as database URL, and by calling env db, it does all the parsing for you. So that's cool. And handy. And it looks like it's doing the same with cache URL. So there's some niceties there for sure. I'm guessing that's the extra stuff that it adds. So yeah, and they're providing these extra, this is how you do it. See, they're not saying like you have to set true or false. If for debug, you just say on. So its mere presence would turn on debug settings if you needed to run with that, which you should only ever do on localhost. Don't deploy something to production, or certainly not to production. I would suggest not deploying something on the onto the internet with debug settings, because let's say you had any kind of sensitive data, like maybe you're sending out real emails in your app or something like that, and you have mailgun keys on your staging environment. Well, somebody can pretty easily provide an improper URL just by typing gibberish on like, so let's say the site was staging.collegeconductor. This doesn't actually work, but collegeconductor.com, and that's where you kept your staging stuff. I don't, but we can pretend. If someone just types in some junk here, and there's no route in your URLs file that will match that, if you had debug on and this was on the internet, the debug page would show up. Debug page is really helpful. It gives you a lot of information if you're debugging, but it also gives you a lot of information if you're debugging. So it includes all of your settings, like, you know, environment variables, all sorts of stuff that you don't really want to expose would suddenly be exposed very easily. So don't turn on debug on production. That's my public service announcement for the day. Okay, so we've got this example of how to create an environment file. It gives us the kinds of things that we can do. That's kind of cool. It's showing us the little extra niceties that it added with DB URL, cache URL. Oh, you can even do email URL. That's fun. So it's aware of extra stuff, or and it's aware of, like, what am I trying to say? The settings you might want to use for testing. So one of the different mail interfaces is this dummy mail or memory mail. So if you actually have unit tests that are testing mailing functionality, but you definitely don't want to send out mail because that would be kind of silly to have your test do that, then you can specify a different mail setup so that it will just do it in memory or something like that, or just do nothing at all. And it looks like that's configurable. So you could probably set up some test settings that way. And what else is in here? You can do multi-line strings. Okay, whatever. All right, so there's some cool stuff in here, and it looks like it's a pretty simple. Not simple's not the right word. It looks like it's a straightforward project that you can digest and understand the whole thing. I mean, the entire documentation is on a single page. So kudos to them. Seems like a cool project. Okay, what do I do have a critique about this style though, and it's a critique about 12-factor in general. There's a security element that can be a problem if you are putting secrets in environment variables. So there's a thought out there of secrets should not be in environment variables. Why? When you put secrets in environment variables, they persist through a lot of circumstances that you might not expect. For example, if for whatever crazy reason, and I can think of a few offhand, if you are forking out to a sub-process to do some work on behalf of your Django app, like maybe you have for some reason needed to call Git. I don't know why, but some other sub-process. That child process is going to inherit the environment from your parent process, and you don't know if something malicious could be in that code or what that might make it easy for a nefarious person to read out all of your environment variables. Environment variables are a very easy thing to read in a lot of circumstances. And so that would be a good way to get that stuff. So if you're putting environment secrets into your environment variables and you have environment variables leak for some reason, then you're kind of in trouble. So one line of thought is that environment variables should not go into, or excuse me, secrets should not go into environment variables. So where do you put them is like the next logical question that comes out of that. It depends on how big your system is, how hardcore you want to be about it. Some groups will spin up an entire extra service, like HashiCorp has one called Vault. And Vault, I've never used Vault, but it sounds like an amazing product. But it also sounds like an amazingly complex product. So it can do all sorts of stuff. It can guarantee that you need a certain number of people to unlock keys, change things so that no single person can have like ultimate authority on your systems. There's a lot in here. So secret management is the name that usually is associated with these kind of tools. Amazon has one built in. AWS KMS, I think, key management service. I want to say they've also come out with a more natural one to, like, key management service is pretty low level. There is another one that AWS has that's like meant to be a little bit more user friendly, I believe. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head. The point is, like, a lot of the big cloud vendors will give you access that you can call APIs to ask for secrets, so that those things are never stored in environment variables. You can have it so that they must be refreshed after a certain amount of time. You can go pretty extreme on how intense you get with secret management. So that's one strategy, is to use a secret management tool from a cloud vendor or a self-hosted one like HashiCorp. Another strategy for doing this, and one that I've opted to do, is put the secrets into a configuration file. That the configuration file is read when the application starts up, and that's how it gets its secrets. That to me rings a little bit more true than strictly putting them in the operating system's environment variables. Now, it's true that, like, if someone could hack into your machine, they could find that settings file and get that. But frankly, if someone's able to hack into your machine, you're kind of toast already anyway. So that's one route. And notice that Django environment here, it can do this. It can do it with a .env file. So it's entirely possible that if you did not want to use operating system environment variables to inject the settings at runtime, that you could create an environment file and deploy that with your app to do this proper reading. So that option does seem available here. I'm not convinced that it's like a first-class citizen here. I think this is definitely more designed to read from environment variables, which works well with stuff like Heroku and services like that kind of expect that mode. Okay, so that was a long discussion to cover this one package. Let's see if there are others. I saw another one or two in here that looked interesting. There's another recommendation for environment. Oh, this one sounded interesting. Django configurations. So let's see what this one does. Okay, so it's a little bit more Python centric. It's leading on composability of Python classes, it says. And what's the example? So you bring in this configuration thing and then you can define them. Oh, okay. I see what it's doing. So their mentality here is you might want to hard code your modes of development in into your system and then load that based on one environment variable. So if you have a test mode, a test configuration, or a dev configuration, along with the settings module, you would also export the configuration so that this would inform this configurations tool to load dev versus prod versus whatever. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, and here they give the example of it adds an extra setting to run server to be able to switch that. Or you can just set the environment yourself. That's cool. So this is an interesting pattern. It's not necessarily one that I think I'd want to put in my app. I can understand the appeal to it, but what I'm not seeing is like, because I want to be able to say here's a whole environment by a file. Essentially, that's kind of where I'm ultimately looking to go. Is can I give you a file that has all of my environment defined in it, and I can pass that in as I start up my application so that it knows what to read. And this does not seem to satisfy that pattern. It like wants you to have everything predefined in the settings, which is okay, but I don't think it handles the dynamic problem very well. But in fairness, I'm just looking at the overview. Maybe it can do all sorts of stuff. Reading, yeah, I mean, it's got, okay. So it can read values from other places, it looks like, by using this value class that you can maybe override or change. And you set the configuration using the values. Different. That's how they all have to get in this notion of you have to deal with types, and you have to be able to convert to the right proper type. So every system is probably going to have something like this that's either giving you a function to cast to, like we saw in the last example by passing in bool directly, or giving you kind of a wrapper with this. Probably what this Boolean value is doing is under the covers is doing that casting to bool and figuring things out properly. All right, so interesting. What else we got in here? This is a good list for not just configuration tools. There's lots of interesting stuff in here. What is Django Lifecycle? It may have nothing to do with configuration, but it sounded cool. So I see. This has nothing to do with configuration. It's more about signals. Okay. Looks like fun to look into anyway, at a later time. Well, maybe that's the list that we've got for now. But that's a pretty good list. I mean, I don't expect everything in here to be configuration. Is there a way to supply keys as not environment variables? Yeah, I think, I don't know if you came in a little second later, but I like, so secret management tools. Like HashiCorp's, I'm gonna write all these down in case anyone else comes in. HashiCorp's Vault or AWS KMS. So those are things that you would, it's almost like you would almost need a client, or maybe it's as simple as a HTTP request to some APIs that they define. So you would ask for, okay, what's my database credentials? And you do the API request and get that down. And that way it wouldn't be stored in your environment variables, but it would just be in memory, because you will have read it out of the API request. So good question. Okay, there's another suggestion. So Django environment seems to be pretty popular, it's come up now numerous times. And database URL is kind of like a where we saw in Django environment the environ.db thing. It was parsing a database URL. So this is a tool that you can use to make that management easier, and put it in that format. Otherwise, you have to do, well, we can look at my own settings because I don't actually use it right now. You have to supply engine, name, user, password, host, all as separate things. Well, sorry, not engine, but these other four, you have to supply as separate things. And if we go back to the docs on environment for a second, you can see what it does is in the entire default block. So this is probably returning not actually a string. So it's taking the string and it's returning an entire dictionary with all of this stuff populated by parsing that string into its proper pieces. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so Django Lifecycle was not something that we wanted to use. Was there anything else in here? No. Okay. So we'll look at the other one that I had on my radar, that I saw a while ago. It's from Lincoln Loop, and they are like a Django consultancy. I don't know that they would pitch themselves as a purely Django consultancy, but I know they do a lot of Django. And this is their model. So one of the, and it still has some of the same stuff, like the part that is consistent across the board here is you still have to do the wiring yourself. So where you have things that need to be configurable, that are meant to be actual settings that change per environment, you have to like connect the dots to the secret key or the debug or databases, whatever. And you can see their method of doing this. And in fact, here's an example of using DJ database URL to switch stuff around. So here's something I liked about this project is you can generate the configuration file that you'll need for a particular, like as a starting point. So you make your config class, and then from that config, you can tell it to generate itself so that it if you restart it with that file, receiving that file, that it can process that correctly. It's in the right format. So I thought that was really cool. And you can see they've got the same notion of casting. So changing the types, like if you need a Boolean, you can do that. But one thing I like about this is that it does dump it to an actual file, and an actual file that can be structured. Like a lot of people poo-poo on YAML, and maybe they should. There's a lot of crazy stuff that you can do with YAML, like executing code in the YAML file if you're not careful. But if you're strictly controlling the YAML file and you're being careful about what inputs are going in there, then it's a reasonably safe format. Maybe not the best format. I'm not saying it's all amazing, but it's still a good format. So if you can use a YAML file and get a structured syntax out of this that can allow for nesting or just a better structure than just a flat, like if we go back and look at that environment file as an example, it was very flat. And maybe that's all you'd ever need is a super flat structure, but maybe it's not. Maybe there's a way that you need to do something deeper because you have more complex setup configuration needs. So I think between the two, between Django environment and GoodCop sounds more interesting to me. So what I want to probably do next is start this process of using GoodCop to migrate like the settings and split apart what I have as config and what I have as settings, and make this work in a pretty smooth way so that I can do it with my development environment as I need to, and that I can do it with my staging and my production environments. And also I use Ansible as my deployment tool, so ultimately the settings file is probably going to be templated within Ansible, which has placeholders, because all of my secret values are in my Ansible vault, and those have to be read out when I do my deployment, when the vault gets unlocked and reads all the secret stuff. We'll put it in this file and deploy and sit next to it. There are also some interesting aspects that I really liked about this project is this default thing. So one pattern, this pattern right here sounds super interesting to me, is I can say the default location is going to be etc my project, which in my case is conductor, and then I can say settings.yaml or something like that. So it will look for that when it loads it in order to do the right thing. So that sounds cool. And there's some other cool stuff about this. They have some extra stuff so that you can actually have help information along with your settings. That's not something, was that in Django environment? Maybe it was and I missed it. So in fairness, okay. They do that with comments, but I'll tell you, so I work in an environment that has lots of settings. I work for Dr. On-Demand currently, and it's a big Django project, hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And there are settings for all sorts of things, all sorts of relationships with various partners and third-party integrations and this, that, and the other thing. And our settings file at work, it's challenging, to be blunt. And the reason it's challenging is because like the configuration in those settings, it's not necessarily always clear of what those are for. And I think part of that is that it's easy to put a comment with something, but that information doesn't necessarily travel well. Like in the example with GoodCop, it's possible, I don't know if this tool does this, but you could probably dump out a settings file that may dump the help information along with it. So you always have a clear indicator of whoever the consumer is of the settings file, whoever's actually setting this stuff, whether that be a DevOps team or an SRE team or whatever. You can give clear breadcrumbs to those consumers to know what the settings are. When it's just in a Python comment, that becomes much more difficult to pass around. So that having help is very interesting to me, and it seems like a very good observation from the folks at Lincoln Loop when they put this together of what to do. So good on them. There's some other interesting stuff here, like initial, if things aren't defined, that you can define them. That's all fascinating. Okay. So I think this is the tool that I want to go down, even after assessing the other tool. This one does intrigue me the most. And we will start the process of pulling out settings out of my current settings setup, and we'll dig into, I've got some unusual patterns of my own to deal with the inadequacies of using pure Python files and the ability to override stuff. We'll dig into how I made that work and what we'll have to do to change it. So let's get to some code, shall we? And I should note that GoodCop does, I believe, require Python 3. Let's check out their setup. They use setup config for everything. Check out their setup config. So you got the classifiers here. So it supports 3, 5, and up. So if you're on Python 2 still, good luck. No, I'm on Python 2 at work. So this is a tool that's interesting to me, but I can't adopt it at work even if I wanted to. At least not yet. We're well on our way to getting to Python 3. But that is a limitation that you have to be aware of. Okay. Let's start by going to PyPI and see what version of GoodCop is actually generally available to use. 1.0. Awesome. Okay, so let's get out of here. We're on the master branch. I put all of my requirements. I use pip tools for installing stuff and a requirements.include file to actually put the top level packages, not including their dependencies. So we're going to come down to here and put GoodConf of 1.0.0. Okay, 1.0.0. And add that. And the other thing that we need to do is to start the virtual environment and run, oh, I don't know, head 10 of requirements txt. Okay, I need to do that because this is the requirements txt file is actually generated by this command here. So pip tools is going through and getting all the dependencies. So if I want to update and have the full lock file, if you will, of the packages I need to install, I need to generate a new one. So by running pip compile, it should do that. And it's showing us the output here, but we should also be able to see the diff. Looks like GoodConf has no settings itself, or no dependencies itself. So that's why we only see it one place. If it did have dependencies, we'd see this requirements txt would show a different line that said something something via GoodConf. Oh, that would be the difference. Okay, so what will we do now? Let's install that stuff. So pip install requirements txt, and it installed GoodConf. Very good. Which is tiny, I guess. That was really quick. All right, next step. So currently, I'm using a settings file that's called base, and we have different versions of this, and this is what I probably will need to find a way to eliminate with different files to represent the different configurations. So for instance, the database here is using a SQLite memory database just for speed. It was convenient at the time. There are going to be these tricky ones. I'm not really sure how to resolve this kind of issue. Like when I run my test suite, I explicitly disable migrations. I think that that's a valuable way to go because migrations can take a long time, and I can run migrations elsewhere to kind of check on them periodically. So that is a worthwhile trade-off to my mind, because some migrations can take hours to run on other systems. Mine is not that case, but you know, depends on how many migrations you have. So some of these are definitely set at the Python level, and I'm not sure how a config tool like GoodCop could handle that, resolve that. So we might still have some level of dealing with extra files. We'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it, I guess. So, but the definite thing we need to do is follow their documentation example of creating a configuration file, which they've called conf. I have no reason to, that seems like a reasonable name, so I'll follow that pattern. And we'll create a new file, call it conf.py. And in here we're going to import, from GoodCop import, did they call it capital GoodCop? Yeah. GoodCop and value. Okay. We haven't used that yet, so we need to create our configuration, and which they have called config. It's a good enough name for me. And this is the configuration settings for college conductor, which is the name of this product. Okay. And I'm not inputted. Why can you not find that? Let's try this again. Maybe it's because I installed it and Vim just didn't know about it yet. So let's put this back on there. Go back to that conf file. Cannot find module name GoodConf. Huh. Why? Or is it, maybe it's Tox or MyPy complaining? All right. That's gonna, the little red checks on the side are annoying. So we're gonna make those go away. And I'm pretty sure it's coming from MyPy. So let's try this one more time. Oh, okay, that was right. Because now instead of angry red, it's now -- yellow. So it's just warning me that the value is not used yet, but we're about to use it. So here's an example of being able to control this. I'm just going to steal it because it's good enough. And this is getting us that access to that debug setting, which, as we said, will be turned off everywhere. That's the default is false, unless explicitly turned on. Okay, so that's enough to start testing this out. We can play. This will give us the ability to try and generate the YAML file, feed that into the system to give it places to like look for something, maybe locally, test out the local development, and try that much. And maybe we spent a lot of this session talking about the tools itself and kind of getting into some of the theory of why. And let's spend a minute to finish off connecting debug to the config and generating the files and hooking all that up. And perhaps the next time I stream, we'll get down into each of the individual settings and grind through that. So let's go back to settings base, and we're going to do a relative import here of from .conf import config. So that's the class. So we haven't used it yet, so it's complaining. And so the first thing that it does is it constructs a config and specifies default files. So I'm good with that strategy. And default files. And do they have more documentation here? Or is this the whole documentation? Okay, so it can also read the path to the file name. That's interesting. So if you don't want to hard code in the default files, you can also pass that as an environment variable, so it goes to know where the file is to load from. I can see the value in that. I don't know that I care though. I think default files might be good enough. And I don't want to trigger the load method during instantiation, I think. So, oh, I see what they're doing. Okay. They actually created the config at the bottom of the conf file, not in the settings file. Let's do that. That way that what you import up here is an already instantiated config, but it's not loaded yet. Okay, that makes sense. So this is config, default files, and that is going to be a list of places to look for. And we're not going to hook this up today. This will be something that we'll need to change in Ansible. But we'll just say Etsy conductor, and if I don't like this path later, we can change it. Settings YAML, I don't know. Okay. Oh, they have a backup one here. So this is like the local one. If so, maybe that's like the one you don't check into version control. So I like that pattern. That sounds pretty good to me. So let's have that too. So now we've got our config, and before we do anything with it, we have to tell it to load. That seems pretty easy. Okay. So what do we have next here? So now we need to connect this thing. So you can see here that I've put in this note about other, like I explicitly set this to false, so that if we go through some of these other settings, like my development definitely wants it to be true. But I'm trying to get rid of this file, basically, is what we're going for. So if we can, that'd be great. My production very much wants it to be false, so it like doubly sets it to be very clear that this will never come on. Staging just inherits from the base, so it has it false. And then testing, my testing settings have it set to true, kind of dump out extra information. So eventually we'll get to, I might be we might be creating separate YAML files for some of this local, either development or testing. I'm not really sure where all these are going to ultimately exist. But having this be config.debug should be enough to start. And let's move this comment. This comment kind of becomes useless now. Other settings must explicitly opt in for debug mode. That's sort of implied by saying the default is false. So I think it's time for that comment to go away. So over here, let's start a new let's turn on the virtual environment and start up Honcho, which is my local development server. See if it all is working. It's not quite working because I don't have Rabbit started. We can do that. We can start that. That's okay. So let's shut that down for a second. I keep RabbitMQ on my Mac to run things because it's not super difficult to do. It means I can avoid containers for as long as possible. It means I don't have to work on a virtual machine. I think it has a bunch of nice benefits. The system is small enough that I can get by doing this. I also have Postgres installed locally to have a real database to talk to. So now Rabbit is running. We can start Honcho, and this time it's able to, the worker, which is here, is able to connect. But that's kind of irrelevant to configuration settings. So this is being served on localhost 8080. Go over there, and here we are. We've got, check out our settings, and you should see debug. Debug is true. Oh, debug is true right now because the development settings are still pulling from that other thing. That was totally vague, I'm sorry. They're still pulling from this file over here. So the Honcho file that starts everything up is configured to, there's a bunch of indirection going on here. It's configured to pull its settings from here, which is this .gunicorn file. If we go in here, oh boy, where's that? Where's the development settings configured? Are you in? How would I recommend a way to transfer the environment you work on to someone else for their own development? Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I do make it possible. Everything, because I run all this stuff in continuous integration too, so I run my test suite. I don't have the constraint of needing to work with other people. This is like a small individual project for myself. So if I needed to hire a contractor or something like that to bring them on board and have that person do development on Conductor, I would need to improve my documentation. But essentially the process would be somehow get RabbitMQ and Postgres installed. If they're on a Mac, that would be through Brew, would be my recommended path. And then they could create a local virtual environment. So there's definitely limitations to the setup that I've chosen. It's a scheme that I've felt has worked for me, and I like it for a couple of reasons. The primary one being having stuff local and just generally makes things easier to test and debug. Like, I'm not digging through extra file systems with Vagrant or mounts or Conductor spinning up, not Conductor, containers spinning up images and instances and all that stuff. So, you know, it's a trade-off of the speed of which this enables me to work, and I'm the only one that has to be concerned with this setup, is one thing. And you know, if you had to work on a big team, you either definitely document this process. I worked at a company that has similar setup, and we just documented the process of here are the things you need to brew install. Everybody had a Mac, so that was just the way of things. Or you move to a different team. My current team, was using Vagrant is now using containers. So I've dealt with all the major modes of laptop versus containers versus VMs, and they all have their pluses and minuses. This setup works for me for this little project. Okay, so here's what the secret that was missing of how my Honcho tool was actually getting the development settings. It's getting it from the stuff that was set as the default here, because I didn't specify it anywhere. So that's pulling from down here to get the true value. So as I mentioned in the docs here, one thing that we can do is run this line to dump out the configuration, and to translate for my scenario will be my project will replace with the word settings, because that's the package that I have for that stuff. Let's copy that. Just see what I haven't even seen what it produces yet, so this will be interesting. So let's get rid of my project and say settings, and this is settings conf generate, and I think I called this in the conf file, I think I called it settings YAML. Settings has no attribute conf. Hooray! Why? Settings, there's an init, there's a conf. What's going on? Import settings. What do you have settings? Nothing. That's strange. Okay, I'm in the right place. How about from settings import conf? Yeah, okay. And then conf config. Yep, there it is. Okay. All right, we'll change this line a little bit. It's okay, it'll work. We'll just ditch that, and change this to from settings import conf. Oh. So they're using a different YAML tool. Did they mention this? They might have. Ah, okay. I installed the wrong thing. I installed, they've got optional install packages to get, and I did not get those. Okay, let's fix that. So let's go back to our requirements include, and this time we'll probably see what I was talking about earlier, where we can get the dependencies will be included. So we're going to change this to YAML so that we get the YAML parsing tool, and we're going to do the pip compile command again. And now, if we look at this a little more closely, we have RUML YAML. I don't know much about this YAML parser. I assume it's maybe faster or something. I'm not sure why they picked it. And then we can pip install that requirements file. We've just installed the new YAML tool. And now we can run that same thing again. Now we've got a settings YAML file. Let's look at it. Okay. Oh, this is cool. I like, they've got some trailing spaces. Maybe I should put a PR for that, but so here was that comment I was talking about earlier, is the fact that this is it's got help documentation in the conf file here, means that when we did the generation of the settings file from this change, then that got passed along to this here. That's really great. I like that a lot. So now any other consumer of this, which might be a DevOps team or an SRE team, would be able to say, oh, this is how you turn on debugging. Although that should be kind of self-evident for this particular example, but you can think of more complex settings that you might have in the future. Okay, now I'm gonna come down to this development one, and I'm going to say, let's just comment this out for a second. And so if this worked as we want, this thing is now set to true. This is set to false by default. But if it's going to read the settings YAML file, which it should, then it will parse that, see that it's set to true, and will set debug to true. So if we go back and test in the local environment, even though that I've told it to use a different or commented out the debug equal true from the settings file, it should pick that up from the local settings. So we can fire that up and come back over here, refresh, and I mean, the fact that the debug toolbar here is telling me this has already worked. Debug is true. Awesome. Okay, so now the question becomes, how does this fit into my current way of working? Like, what files do I keep around as settings files? Like, do I have everything that's in this debug or in this development file? Do I need to expose that somehow? There's some interesting questions to figure out here, because if you look at these, this one's definitely kind of a no-brainer of we're setting debug to true, and we've done that with the settings file. Okay, fine. But what about a tuple? What about adding to installed apps? What about adding a new middleware? All of those, they smack more of configuration rather than settings. So maybe it makes sense for them to stay. Like, maybe this isn't going to kill off all of these different settings files that I have. I'm torn about that though, because if one route would be to have one settings file that does everything. Like, instead of having development, it would just be everything is just base. And if you want to change something, it's the config that changes it. Period. End of story. Some of these are really easy to make that case, but like I said, when it comes to what do you do with the Python-centric changes, I'm not really sure. So I think what I want to do is think on that, sleep on it, take a week to consider it. So I'm probably going to stop the stream here for this evening, and let's think about what we covered. We looked at a bunch of configuration tools. We got a basic GoodCop going. I don't think I've answered yet like how the development stuff is going to read the development settings right away. Maybe we should see if there's a way to pass that in, or maybe the only way is to do that option to if you have a file environment variable to look for. We could do that for that one. Perhaps the load gives you an option to read from a different path. Yeah, I'm not real clear on like if I'm going to start, say, Unicorn, how to pass it in. aside from defining it as a default file, which I'm not crazy about. It seems to be this option here. So maybe we'll configure that next time, and then try and hopefully have come up with an answer for what do we do about environment-specific settings that actually affect Python code. I don't know yet. So hope that was useful to you. I'm kind of exploring this space with you. Oh, no problem, Coco Crazy. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for good questions. I will put up this video on YouTube if you want to check it out later, review anything that we talked about. What else can I say? I've got, you can like, subscribe, follow, depending on where you're viewing this, whether that's Twitch or YouTube, whatever. I would appreciate that. If you have questions for me that you want to ask on Twitter, I'm MB Layman there. You can also go to the website and find my email list where I write about technology stuff. I write about Python and the web space primarily. So if you're wanting to learn through that avenue, that's something I do as well. But definitely appreciate y'all tuning in, and I will see you next time. Take care.